Thank you for that introduction, Mark, and good morning, D3 Democratic Club and neighbors and Supervisor Bardis and Kay Burke and Linda Marks. And thank you, Howard, for stewarding the District 3 Democratic Club these past years through the pandemic. I want to jump into it, but let me just start with a little bit of my own kind of code of the ballot. And I think it's important for everybody to kind of understand how I see the ballot. And part of that is technical, which is how do things get on the ballot? What do you elect me and my colleagues and the mayor to do? And what do you need to vote on and why? So I'll jump right into that and I'll do it quickly because we have 7 local measures on the June ballot. And if I have 50 minutes left, that's about 7 minutes each. There are no state measures on the June ballot. The state legislature actually voted to only have statewide measures on the November ballot. So there are no statewide measures on the June ballot. I'm, as you heard,
Nice clear picture.
I'm a former chair of the local Democratic Party, so I urge you to vote the Democratic slate at the top of the ticket. So I'll dispense with all of that and go to what is required to be on the ballot. Any change to our local constitution, the charter of the city and county of San Francisco, whether they are good changes, whether they are mundane changes, whether they are bad changes, can only be approved by the voters of San Francisco by a majority vote. If you want to change anything in the charter, that requires a vote of the people. If you want to raise any tax of any kind, that requires a vote of the people. That is state law. So if you want to, as Proposition A is, sell a general obligation bond, that requires a 2/3 majority of the electorate. If you want to have a sales tax, a utility users tax, you name it, that requires a vote of the people. What else gets on the ballot? Most of what else gets on the ballot is the function of politics, sometimes self-serving and for political advancement of causes or candidates who want to make a name for themselves by associating themselves with something on the ballot. Sometimes it is when a supervisor has tried to pass something through the normal process that he or she is elected to do and has been unable to do it, like a mayoral veto of legislation that the mayor vetoes. There is an avenue to go to the electorate, the court of last resort. There are instances where a minority of supervisors are trying to pass legislation that they think the electorate would support, but a majority of the Board of Supervisors is unwilling to pass it. The electorate can weigh in. How do you get it on the ballot? Either 6 members of the Board of Supervisors, through public process and deliberation, vote to put it on the ballot, as you'll see in some of these measures, and the mayor can put something, an ordinance, not a charter amendment, on the ballot with her sole or his sole signature. And this has been in the charter since 1932, and it's an interesting charter provision. 4 individual members of the board with their signatures has the same power as the mayor, and they can put something directly on the ballot without having any hearings at City Hall. And there are some examples of that on this ballot. So I just wanted to give you those kind of background pieces of information as we assess these things. And with that, I'll hop right into it. I'll give very brief descriptions. I will tell you my biases, but the District 3 Democratic Club and every individual voter will come to his or her own conclusion. And God bless that. That is the democratic process. And I will note that all of us should have received a ballot in our mailboxes some time ago. Nancy and I have already voted. The election is in full swing right now. And the last time to vote is on June the 7th at 8 p.m. All of our local polling places are open. You can also go down to City Hall and vote early, or you can turn that ballot in. And I am proud of the fact that years and years ago, getting on to 20 years ago, I voted to have the city pay for the return of your ballot. So you don't even have to stick a stamp on it. So please vote between now and 17 days from now. Democracy is best served when the most number of individuals weigh in. With that, I will jump to Proposition A. Proposition A is a general obligation bond. This is authority granted by the voters of San Francisco for the city over time to sell up to $400 million in bonds on Wall Street, and over a period of 30 years to retire that debt with interest. It is $400 million for the SFMTA, commonly we think of as Muni. The vast majority of it, $250 million of it for the repair and renovation of our ailing bus yards and facilities and equipment. About $250,000 for traffic improvements like traffic signals, wider sidewalks at bus stops, a teeny little bit, probably not enough, $10 million for the improvement of our train control systems, about $40 million for traffic signal improvements and pedestrian signals, pedestrian signals, curb ramps and signs, about $40 million for street redesign, including wider sidewalks, raised crosswalks, protected bike lanes, and the balance about $30 million for projects to manage traffic speeds, including the infrastructure required to lower speed limits and speed radar signs. We now, under state law, which interestingly enough governs our ability to govern our own streets, are now in certain instances able to reduce speed limits, which I think is a good thing. And you will see that actually roll out here in the next few months on Polk Street in our district. So that is Proposition A. It was placed on the ballot by every member of the Board of Supervisors and is supported by the mayor. Now let's get to the issue of how much does it cost? General obligation bonds are paid for through our property taxes. So presumably, if you sell $400 million worth of bonds, it should raise our property taxes. But for the last decade and a half, San Francisco has done something that I think is unique and forward-thinking, which is that we have taken, albeit it could be changed at any time, but we have adhered to it for the last 16 years, a pledge to never sell any more bonds than bonded indebtedness that we retire. So in the past, we have voted for recreation and parks bonds to fix parks. We have voted for street surfacing bonds. We have voted for bonds for the rebuilding of San Francisco General Hospital and Laguna Honda. And as we retire that debt, we issue no more new debt than we retire. As a result, if you are a property owner, marginal tax rate has not increased since 2006. Now, that does not mean that your property taxes haven't gone up, because every year the value of your property under Prop 13 can go up as much as 2%. So your property taxes might creep up, not because your tax rate has gone up, but because the value of your property has inched up. And by the way, as we're having this conversation about taxation, this Solomonic pledge that San Francisco made does not include the school district, does not include the BART district, does not include the community college district. So remember that when you vote for a BART bond or a school parcel tax, that can actually raise your marginal property tax rate. So that's a little, but basically what this is to say, voting for Proposition A will not raise your property tax rate. We have in this bond, as we have in virtually every other general obligation bond in the last 20 years, included a provision that 50% of the cost of this bond can be passed through to tenants. But insofar as it doesn't raise the marginal tax rate, there isn't a pass-through, but that provision exists in the measure. I am happy to answer any questions about Proposition A.
The language of legal language of Prop A, like many bonds, has general categories of expenditures. In this case, facilities, fleet, maintenance. but it also says not limited to. How do we know that Muni isn't going to spend the money on things that we never intended it to?
Good question. And the answer is threefold. One is the language in the bond itself that says that we are supposed to spend within the categories laid out in the bond. Two is the fact that there is oversight by the General Obligation Bond Oversight Committee before they can come to the Board of Supervisors to ask us to actually sell any of these bonds. So step one is the voters by a 2/3 majority has to say yes. Then the then you don't sell all 400 million at once. These are sold over many years. So at some point, the MTA comes forward and says, we are ready, we need $50 million in cash to do the following improvements. We want it out of these categories. The General Bond Oversight Committee says, yes, we believe that this is consistent with the language of the bond. Then they come to the Board of Supervisors. The Board of Supervisors has to vote by a supermajority of 8 out of 11 and has to make findings that indeed that it meets the language that was put before the voters. So that's the answer to your question, Howard. Seeing no further questions, I will move on to Proposition B. A lot of things that happen in life and politics are reactions to things that have preceded our actions. And we are all sadly living through the wake of probably a not yet completely finished ongoing corruption scandal that has we have all experienced and we have all read about. At the top of that list was Mohammed Nuru at the Department of Public Works, which in part led to 2 other measures on this ballot, Propositions E and F. There was the ongoing scandal at the Department of Building Inspection that led to the indictment of a building inspector named Bernie Curran and the resignation of the head of the Department of Building Inspection, Tom Huey, and the resignation of a bunch of senior officials, or I should say retirement of a bunch of senior officials at that department, like Ed Sweeney. And this measure that was chiefly sponsored by my colleague Supervisor Melgar, but was put on the ballot by a unanimous vote, is not by any means a silver bullet magical cure, but what it does is modifies the charter section that deals with the Department of Building Inspections Commission and how the executive director of that department is hired. Now I will get into a little bit of arcane government history that Howard Wong probably remembers, and maybe some of the rest of you remember, which is the Department of Building, John Bardis definitely remembers this. The Department of Building Inspection up until 1996 was the Bureau of Building Inspection. Interestingly enough, ensconced in what department? Do you remember, John? You don't remember? Howard, do you remember?
Oh, yes, it was part of my DBW department.
That's right. It was a bureau inside of the Department of Public Works. And I lived here and I voted in 1996, but I can't remember what I was thinking at the time. But here is what happened. People were very concerned with the backlog of permits and the bureaucracy and an unholy alliance of a guy named Joe O'Donoghue, who was the head of the Residential Builders Association, and a guy named Randy Shaw, who was and still is the head of the Tenderloin Housing Clinic that has master leases thousands of units of single resident occupancy, low income, extremely low income housing, primarily in the Tenderloin, joined up, and I should have mentioned this in my original words, There's another way you can get stuff on the ballot, which is by going out and getting signatures. And you can get an ordinance on the ballot by going out and getting signatures. And with an even higher threshold of signature gathering, you can amend the charter, or you can get a charter amendment on the ballot. And Mr. O'Donoghue funded an effort to put then Proposition G in 1996 on the ballot, which ripped the Bureau of Building Inspection out of the Department of Public Works, made it its own department, gave its commission, created a commission over it, which was very interesting and very different than virtually every other commission in city government, which allowed the mayor to directly appoint 4 members of the Building Inspection Commission and allowed the Board of Supervisors president to directly appoint 3 members of the Department of Building Inspection Commission. And none of those 7 members were subject to confirmation, any public process, any public hearings, and could not be removed for any reason, and had the ability to hire or fire their executive director without any other oversight or intervention from the rest of the government, the mayor or the Board of Supervisors. What Proposition B does is it makes the Building Inspection Commission like most of the rest of the commissions, which is that the mayor does not appoint, the mayor nominates. The Board of Supervisors must, through public hearings, vet those candidates and confirm them, or like the United States Senate, reject them. And the Board of Supervisors president's nominees have to go through that same process in front of the public and the rest of the Board of Supervisors. And that commission, like most commissions, has the authority, has the ability to submit 3 candidates for director to the mayor, and the mayor would make the appointment, as compared to what happens now, which is that the Building Inspection Commission director is solely appointed by the commission. Also, the composition of the commission, which in the past was heavily weighted to commissioners that, how do we say it, had conflicts. They had to be, in the past, a residential builder, a representative of a nonprofit housing developer, which was always Randy Shaw's Galler guy, an architect, which was always Joe O'Donoghue's Galler guy, an engineer. So it was always a conflicted commission, and this changes that. It is not miraculously going to change the culture of the Department of Building Inspection, but it is definitely a step in the right direction, and I am happy to answer any questions. Yes, Mark.
This is only the right time to talk about this because you have so much experience with these other aspects of the building process. So for all of us to know, there's something called the director's hearing, which I've been to several times. Many of you hopefully have. Access Appeals Commission within the building department, the Board of Examiners, and the Building Inspection Commission, which is the subject of Proposition B, and then something called the Code Advisory Committee. So to speak about one in particular that I dealt with not so long ago, the Board of Examiners is an example of this very complicated network of advisors. In this case, they're appointed, I understand, entirely from the Building Inspection Commission. And I'm wondering what your thought is, Aaron, on these other parts of the building process, the appeals process, for those of us in the public who might want to, for instance, are in favor of preservation. So should we think in the future about combining these things because they're so complicated, or in the case of the Board of Examiners having a better way to nominate members? How do you feel about these other?
I mean, this charter amendment does not in and of itself delve into any of the bureaucratic minutia that is the entire infrastructure of our Department of Building Inspection with all of its vestiges. But I would say this at a high level, which is that when you have a better process for appointing commissioners who don't end up being crooks like Mel Murphy, and by the way, Ed Lee appointed Rodrigo Santos to the Building Inspection Commission. I mean, this is a true fact. I mean, this guy is about to, go to jail. He's been indicted, sadly, not by us, but by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the U.S. Attorney. And this man was a actual building inspection commissioner, and I guarantee you that he helped get his, cronies appointed to, all of the aforementioned bodies. So I think at a high level, when you have a more transparent, open process for the appointment of building inspection commissioners, they in turn turn out to be better commissioners, and they appoint better people to the Board of Examiners and, all of the, technical subcommittees that you're referring to. That would be my answer.
Thank you.
With that, I will move on to Proposition C, which I am the author of. It is also, like Proposition B, a charter amendment. It was put on the ballot by a split 7-4 vote of the Board of Supervisors. It deals with the issue of local rules around recalls. Interestingly enough, I started this project before the current recall, that is Proposition H, on the ballot of our district attorney. It was actually, what spurred me to this was the recall, and it seems like eons ago, but it was only 7 months ago, of the governor of the state of California. That actually, recalls have been extremely rare in San Francisco history. Prior to this year, the last recall, which was not successful, was the attempted recall of then Mayor Dianne Feinstein. There has not been another recall that has made the San Francisco ballot since those years, which is over a third of a century ago. But the recall of Newsom, which cost the state of California $200 million to put that special election on, B, was abysmally small turnout, and was, to my mind, a misuse of the process. And afterwards, 2/3 of the electorate of the state of California in polling data said that they wanted the recall process to be reformed at the state level. Well, I'm not in the state legislature, but that got me to crack open the code around our local recall stuff. And by then, by the way, the school board recall was in full swing. And I started looking at this, and I came up with this charter amendment, which was tweaked many times along the way in response to comments, and I think made better. And here are the 2.5 things that it does. Number one is, it says you can't recall anybody in their first year in office. By the way, every office in San Francisco is a 4-year term, whether you are the treasurer, the district attorney, the city attorney, the public defender, the mayor, a member of the board of supervisors, the community college board, the school district. They're all 4-year terms. And the theory there was, number one, you just had a fair and square election, somebody won, and give them a year and before you can go march them out, so that sore losers can't go and recall an elected official in their first year at great cost for no reason. And by the way, in the case of the current recall that's on the ballot, Mr. Boudin, that recall was started after a year, so it would not have affected that. The second thing that it does is it says you can't recall somebody in their last year. Why? Because they're on the ballot anyway, and you can save, I mean, the school board recall, just to not to put too fine a point on it, cost taxpayers of San Francisco $12 million. By the way, not that I, run around and talk about it, but I personally voted to recall those 3 people. I thought they were completely bonkers. And that was my personal choice between me, God, and my ballot. But in the last year, you have that person on the ballot or that seat open in a much higher turnout election. If you look at the 2 elections that we just had, and this is a crazy year, this has never happened before, 4 elections in one calendar year. We've got voter fatigue. We're up to election 3 in 17 days. And one of those was a special election because of that recall. Had it been able to be consolidated into this June's election, we would have saved $12 million of taxpayer money. So you can't recall anybody in their last year in office. And the third thing it does, this is thing 2.5. San Francisco has, as former Supervisor Bartis knows, kind of weird anti-checks and balances provision in its charter that has existed for over a century, which is when there is a vacancy in any office, the mayor appoints that vacancy. Now, that's not what happens in the checks and balances at the federal level or at the state level. For instance, when David Chu left the state legislature in the middle of his term, the voters of San Francisco voted to vote for his replacement. Okay, when there is a vacancy in Congress, the president of the United States doesn't appoint his favorite person who will vote his way to the United States Congress. But in San Francisco, that's the way it has been. This charter amendment takes a little bit of a swipe at that and says that in the case of a successful recall, the mayor can appoint to that vacancy until the next election. And at the next election, that caretaker can't run. So you don't end up with the mayor having an incentive to support an otherwise goofy recall because he or she has an incentive to get that appointment and give it a leg up. The last thing I want to say about Proposition C is that it in no way changes or diminishes or touches the provisions in our local constitution for the removal of someone from any elected office for official misconduct. And the reason I tell you that is because people say, well, holy moly, what if it turns out that after 3 months, and this, by the way, happened to me, although it was 5 months in, I had a colleague who was elected from the sunset in 2006, who served for 5 months before it became completely evident that he was engaged in bribery and extortion. And he was removed from office for official misconduct. So that provision and that safety valve still exists. So that is Prop C in a nutshell.
Who removed him, Aaron? Who removed that person? How did it happen?
Gavin Christopher Newsom was the mayor at that time, and the mayor under the charter can remove any elected official from any office for official misconduct, but there is no corollary provision for any other body or elected official to remove the mayor from office for official misconduct. That provision does not exist in our charter, but the mayor can remove any elected official. As a matter of fact, Mayor Lee removed then Sheriff Ross Mercarimi for official misconduct. And watchers of the board and readers of our charter will know that anybody who has been removed from office for official misconduct has the right to a trial before the Board of Supervisors, and the Board of Supervisors can agree or overturn the mayor by a supermajority vote. So there you have it. But that has been used. It was used at the turn of the last century by a mayor who removed the public defender for killing his mistress.
I'd like to ask a background question on the way the composition of the words, because we're all government nerds kind of, and so I hope if it's too much in the weeds, ignore the question. I read this now 3 times, and I've read it before, letter C, and it's complicated. And I'm just wondering why, when the presentation is made or the wording is decided upon, it couldn't explain a little more of what you just told us. And maybe there are rules about it being a single sentence. So for instance, here it's a single sentence with that last phrase, comma, to prevent the person appointed to fill that vacancy from running, et cetera. It makes it confusing to me. And I'm wondering if it had to be presented this way, or if it's a length of, how does it work?
Are you looking at the actual legal text?
I'm looking at the ballot only, the actual ballot. On the ballot where you vote, it just has a single sentence in English and then in Chinese. Shall the city amend the charter to further limit the period during which the voters could recall, et cetera?
The answer to your question is there is a process by which all of the legalese that is at the back of your voter information pamphlet, which for Proposition C starts on page 115 and goes to page 116. It's actually very short. But there is a process by which all of that is synthesized by the Ballot Simplification Committee, and they come up with what they come up with. And then we all have to do our research and have meetings like this to get into the fine detail and come up with our conclusion as to how we're going to vote. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
With that, I will go on to Proposition D, which was put on by 4 members of the Board of Supervisors, did not have any public hearings, and that was put on by the signatures of Supervisors Stephanie, Haney, Mandelman, and Safai. It would create an Office of Victim and Witness Rights, and the ability for members of our community to obtain legal services for domestic violence. The cost of it, as the controller states, is unknown, because one of the interesting facts of putting an ordinance before the voters is that you cannot, under the charter, bind future Board of Supervisors by a voter approved ordinance when it relates to appropriations. So the only way you can actually commit the city to an ongoing expenditure stream is through a charter amendment, which requires public hearings and a majority of the Board of Supervisors to put on the ballot. So this measure, as the controller rightfully says, under the law, is subject to the vicissitudes of future mayors and future Board of Supervisors as to what this agency would look like, how much it would be funded, and therefore the controller rightfully comes to the conclusion that the costs are unknown. It is also interesting insofar as a number of these services exist in city government at various locations. The district attorney has a victims' rights services. The Department on the Status of Women has similar services. I am in no way saying that they are necessarily well coordinated and what have you. The thought here is good. We all want to provide services, particularly to victims of domestic violence. But I would respectfully submit that this is in some part on the ballot because Proposition H is on the ballot, wherein the district attorney is under scrutiny, and this is an avenue not only to cast doubt and get people to ask the district attorney questions around DV case results, but also is let's just say if Prop H is successful and the district attorney is recalled, that the chief author of this may well be selected to be the next district attorney, and I will leave it at that. The impetus for the public policy, I certainly concur with, but there are complicated political undercurrents, and I'm happy to attempt to answer any questions.
Yeah, one question, Aaron. is this common practice? So you explained that, hey, this is requires a change to the charter amendment. It's a charter amendment or change to that. So it requires a city vote. And that's why it's on the that's why we're voting on this.
Well, if here is the legal minutia, Mr. Ferris, which is if the way I weigh things as a supervisor for most of the last 20 some odd years is this something I can do because you elected me? So the first question I ask myself is, do I need the voters' approval, or do I need the approval of my colleagues and the mayor? Because that's what you elected me to do. So I identify a problem. The problem is the city and county of San Francisco does not have sufficient services and resources for victims of domestic violence. This is a problem. I've identified the problem. What do I do now? I have to create services. Okay, do a little research. What should those services be? How much should they cost? Okay, now I've got an idea. I have a law. I've got an ordinance. I am now going to go down and introduce on Tuesday afternoon an ordinance appropriating $5 million for a pilot program to hire 7 lawyers and 8 social workers and rent for a building and an executive director. I have a program. I go, and generally the way this works is if I can count to 6 and the mayor doesn't veto it, or I can count to 8 and override the mayoral veto, I have done my job and I can go home with a smile on my face. Now, if you choose not to go that route and you go the ordinance route, you only get funding for 1 year, which is why Proposition D says that this is a 1-year pilot program, because that's all you can ask the voters for through a voter approved ordinance. The only way around that would be to amend the charter. If you amend the charter, you could say, shall the voters vote to appropriate $5 million a year now and in every succeeding year forever, or for the next 10 years, whatever you write. And if the voters approve that, it is no longer subject to the appropriative authority of the board and the mayor, only if it's a charter amendment, not if it's an ordinance. But you cannot put the only way to get a charter amendment on the ballot is for a majority of the board to have hearings and put it on the ballot. To put an ordinance on the ballot, you can have hearings, as like, for instance, Proposition F, which we'll get to in a few minutes. I held hearing, it's an ordinance. I held hearings. The board voted unanimously to put it on the ballot. It's an ordinance. Or 4 members of the board can put it directly on the ballot, no hearings. Charter amendments can only be put on the ballot with hearings. So had we had those hearings, people may have said, well, gee, maybe we need to coordinate the existing services that we have better and bring them all together, and we might have ended up with a different result. But we didn't have that opportunity because we never got to talk about it.
And and what do you think about?
And interestingly enough, the Chronicle came to the same conclusion and urges a no on D vote.
Yeah.
But it looks weird, because it looks like politically, it looks like you're voting against, giving services to DV victims.
Yeah, not a good thing. Is this a common, from your experience, what you've seen, is this common for folks for the public to vote on a proposition like this, where just simply the fact that we don't even know the cost of this, seems crazy?
I don't want to say it never happens, but it doesn't happen often.
Cool. Thanks.
That gets us to E, which is also I am the primary author of, and this is part of the reaction to the ongoing corruption scandal in our government. Sadly, after having done this for 20 years, it is just mind-boggling and depressing that this shit goes on, but it has. How do I start this conversation? Let's start it with this. What is a behested payment? Does anybody know what a behested payment is? Mark?
Remember from ethics hearings, It's a payment made by the request of a government official, elected or not, to a third-party nonprofit from somebody the government official could help.
Okay, so you're 90% right.
Okay.
Behested payment simply is when I go and I'll just give you I'll make up an example. I go to Apple Computer and I say, hey, I'm Supervisor Aaron Peskin, and Apple, I would really be delighted and would encourage you to make a donation of 100 laptop computers to the Telegraph Hill Neighborhood Center for the kids and seniors there. It would really be helpful for them. And the executive director asked that I give you a call, and would you be so kind as to donate them? And, I'll publicly acknowledge you or not, whatever. But that's a behested payment. At my behest, I am behesting Apple Computer to give 100 laptops to the nonprofit that is the Telegraph Hill Neighborhood Center. Now, that may be totally fine. Philanthropic giving is a beautiful thing. The Telegraph Hill Neighborhood Center needs laptop computers for the kids, okay? The problem is when Apple Computer is what we define as an interested party. It would be fine if I went to Apple Computer and did a public service to get the kids the computers, except for the fact that I am either about to vote on or voted recently on a contract from the city and county of San Francisco that I, at my discretion with my colleagues, grant to Apple Computer for $100 million of services that the city of San Francisco needs from Apple Computer. That is a behested payment from an interested party. So Mark, you got it 90% right. It's the interested party thing. And so that now let's talk about what happened. What happened is Mohammed Nuru went to our monopoly garbage provider, Recology, and said, hey, would you make donations to the San Francisco Parks Alliance? And Recology said, well, we want to keep Mohammed Nuru happy because he is the sole individual who actually determines what San Francisco residential refuse rates are going to be under the law. So over a period of time, Recology gave $800,000 to the San Francisco Parks Alliance. None of this was for parks. Mohammed then Mohammed set this all up with the Parks Alliance, and they had an account for Mohammed. And then Mohammed would say, hey, would you guys give a donation to my department that I'll use for this, that, and the other, lavish holiday parties, this, that, and the other. And then Mohammed voted to grant them a rate increase of 14.6%, which half of which could not be justified as a matter of fact. This measure outlaws that behavior. Now, you might ask, well, why didn't I just pass that at the Board of Supervisors? And the answer is, I did. I actually passed that at the Board of Supervisors. But then two things happened. One is, and this, I'm sorry to tell you this, but it's true. I couldn't get my colleagues to agree to actually apply that law to ourselves. I am not making this up. They were totally fine with applying it to department heads, but they were not okay with applying it to the Board of Supervisors itself. This upset me, but I got the rest of my law passed. And then a number of them started making noises about wanting to amend it. And so I said, Oh, and the mayor, by the way, was extremely upset about this. We passed it last December. The mayor did not have enough votes to veto it, but she refused to sign it. It was returned unsigned. It still went into law 10 days later, but she refused to sign it, and she started making noises about wanting to change it. And so I figured this was actually a good use of the ballot to take this to the voters to, one, apply it to me and my colleagues, and two, to make it much more difficult to ever change or amend. That is Proposition E. I commend it to you. I hope you will endorse it. It is important for cleaning up this government. And by the way, it in no way prevents me or a department head from soliciting charitable contributions from people who are not doing business with your department. As a matter of fact, it is, this makes me laugh. It doesn't, if the Department of Rec and Park has a contract with the XYZ Corporation to help build a new park, that does not prevent the director of the Department of Public Health from soliciting a donation from the XYZ Corporation, because it's not a department that has a direct contract with the XYZ Corporation. So, I mean, it was written in a way that does not depress philanthropic giving to the city and county of San Francisco. With that, I really hope you'll vote for Prop E. I really hope it passes. It's been endorsed by the League of Women Voters, by the Friends of Ethics, by labor who want to clean up our government, and I hope it will get the D3DC's endorsement. And in the remaining 6 minutes, I will see if I can do F, and I'll do 1 second on H, but F is a ordinance that had to go to the voters, and I will tell you why. There was one thing at the beginning I didn't tell you, which is if the voters approve an ordinance at the ballot, only the voters can change that measure at the ballot. So, which makes sense. The voters vote for something. It's not like the next day, me and my colleagues can go undo it or tinker it with it beyond recognition. What happened here exactly 90 years ago in the year 1932, I've heard stories, but I wasn't around, and I don't know anybody who was around and knew exactly what was going on in 1932. The voters of San Francisco voted to give what today we know as Recology a exclusive monopoly on residential refuse collection in the city and county of San Francisco, and created a regulatory scheme that is not unlike, actually very similar to the relationship that the California Public Utilities Commission has with Pacific Gas and Electric. PG&E has the monopoly in Northern California, and when they want to increase or change their rates or rate structure, they go to the California PUC and say, here's why we need to increase our rates, and the PUC ultimately issues an order as to what that rate increase could be. It is very similar in San Francisco. Recology can petition the city through the Department of Public Works, that then has to hold some public hearings, and the Director of Public Works then issues an order as to the next rate. That last happened in 2017, where Recology, who unbeknownst was making then Public Works Director Mohammed Nuru, asked for a whopping 16% rate increase. Mr. Nuru granted them a 14.6% rate increase, pretty much everything they asked for. Subsequently, we found out that they had, at a minimum, erred, at a maximum cheated the ratepayers of San Francisco to the tune of $94.5 million. We sued Recology. We settled. If you are the person who pays the trash bill in your house, you should have gotten a check or an electronic deposit by now, refunding you for your overpayment. We fined them $7 million, so they paid us a little over 100, but they paid the ratepayers 94.5, which, by the way, included interest on what they cheated on, and a $7 million fine to the city for our trouble suing them. If you were watching the news earlier this week, you will see that that was actually only a part of the overcharges. So we determined about a year ago that the 14.6% increase that Mohammed granted should have been 7%. On Monday of this week, the controller issued a report saying that they discovered an additional $23.4 million in what they call excess profits from the 2017 rate. We are not done. We believe that the ratepayers, as opposed to the taxpayers, have claims to additional funds for the sale of their property at 900 7th Street that the ratepayers helped Recology buy way back when, that they just sold to Amazon for $202 million for a profit of over $195 million. We believe that the ratepayers in part have a claim to that money. At any rate, Proposition F changes the entire way the regulatory structure works. I started this project 2 years ago. I convened an internal working group with outside experts to help us determine what the best path forward was. We looked at a number of different options, ranging from competitive bid to municipalization, which the city of Berkeley and large swaths of the city of New York do, to what we ultimately ended up with, which were tweaks to the 1932 ordinance to make the controller the new rate administrator, to not make it an ad hoc process, but an ongoing process with real-time analysis of revenues versus expenses, actuals versus budget. We changed the rate board composition to include a ratepayer advocate. It is a rare place in city government where the controller, the city attorney, all 11 members of the board, and the mayor are in enthusiastic support. Not surprisingly, Recology flipped out. And in December of last year, 6 months ago, went out and started to gather signatures for their own competing ballot measure. The mayor and I brought them to heel and threatened them with a protracted war, and they ultimately backed out of that and have come to their senses, and hopefully on June 7th, Proposition F will pass overwhelmingly. Happy to answer questions about that. 11 o'clock on the dot. Prop H, vote your conscience. I personally am opposed to that recall. I did not oppose the school board recall. That is my 2 cents on that. Have a lovely rest of the weekend. Do not forget.
Can I ask you, may I ask you one thing quickly? So back to F. Yeah, the refuse rate. So I'm just looking at Recology under the Public Works Department, and you now have reports. Maybe this is new. My simple question is this a new system, or has it always been the case? On the government site, it's the Recology nonprofit disclosure form, and it tells you it goes every quarter of the year. So at the beginning of this year, it shows that.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Is that a new process, or?
That was a requirement of the settlement of the aforementioned lawsuit. We got that included in the lawsuit settlement. It actually did not require, well, it did require, the lawsuit settlement itself took the form of an ordinance, and that was a provision in the lawsuit settlement ordinance that the Board of Supervisors unanimously passed last year.
So every quarter now, they must tell us, Recology, who they're giving money to.
That is correct.
Thank you. Okay, that makes sense. Good.
And by the way, that settlement also prohibited them for a period of 36 months from making any behested payments to anything at the request of any government official.
Okay.
What about Proposition G?
Oh, shoot. I forgot Gordon's problem. That's very funny. Bless you. I totally, how did I just went right over Proposition G, which interestingly enough, I originally flipped out about and said, Supervisor Marr, why are you putting this on the ballot? This is something that we should be able to pass at the Board of Supervisors. I did not disagree with the policy impetus with regard to in a time of COVID and the wildfires that we experienced, to require that large businesses provide emergency public health leave to their employees. It turns out that because of a previous ballot measure that the voters approved, the Board of Supervisors did not have the power to do that without a vote of the people. When the city attorney told me that the only way Supervisor Marr could get this passed was to go to the ballot, I understood that. Once they gave me the evidence, it was put on by the entire board, is supported by labor across the board, and seems in this day and age like a sensible piece of legislation. It does have some sensible, at the request of the Chamber of Commerce, exclusions. And those, if you, I'm just going to read to you from the ballot handbook. So a public health emergency includes a local or state health emergency related to any infectious disease, COVID, and relative to the wildfires, when a spare the air alert is in effect, and employees may use public health emergency leave in certain other circumstances, including when the employee or their family member is unable to work due to the recommendations or requirements of a health order addressing the emergency, the employee or the family member experiences symptoms of the disease causing the emergency or tests positive for the disease, the employee primarily works outdoors and has a heart or lung disease, and is pregnant or is over 60 years of age when a spare the air alert is in effect.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Have a good weekend, everybody. Keep
Well,
your